Ghost in the machine. Is there a security patch for people? We're here to talk about insider threat today. So buckle up, buttercups, because there's some great content to go through. All right.
All right, a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm Greg, the FBI guy. I'll get into my intro for a minute, but just want to say that everything I say here today is based on my personal experience and professional experience working insider threat investigations for the FBI. However, that does not mean that what I say today is the official stance or policy of the FBI or its insider threat program. So if you disagree with anything you say, don't hold that against the FBI or vice versa. If you have a grudge against the FBI, please don't take that against me. We do have our media folks here. She's in charge of making sure I don't say anything I'm not supposed to. So if somebody throws something ahead of my head, it's all part of the show from our media folks. And I was told by my management that, hey, you're coming to RSA, you can't be wearing Bobby Bureau FBI shirt. So I am going to kind of take this off to kind of get a little bit less formal. This is it, nothing more. Anything more, I'd have to get approval from our director. So this isn't DEF CON, it's RSA.
My name is Paul Malcolm. I'm an intelligence advisor at Nisos, the managed intelligence company. I started life doing incident response, incident command, insider threat, third-party risk management, CTI, et cetera. Kind of spanned the gamut. Did federal, state, and local, as well as private sector. With that, over to you, Greg.
Again, so my name is Special Agent Greg Concepcion. I'm a special agent with the FBI here in the San Francisco field office. I've spent 25 years in the FBI, believe it or not. I know I look very youthful, but you get closer and you see the white hairs and everything else. But so I've spent most of my career working insider threat counterintelligence investigations. I did that both in San Francisco and back in our headquarters related to our espionage section. So I've seen and dealt personally with a lot of the significant insider threat espionage cases, as well as economic espionage. And I also have been working in our cyber division for the last 4 years, looking at the cyber insider threat. Currently, I am what is called the threat management coordinator for San Francisco, so I'm underneath our behavioral analysis unit, the criminal profilers, all those guys. So I am assessing all of you too. So the stranger ones, we'll go ahead and have you talk to some agents at the end of the presentation. But so what that means is I look at behavioral indicators for what would be an insider threat.
With that, we got to give a special shout out to Sunil from MITRE's Center for Threat Informed Defense, as well as my partner in crime here from the FBI. U.S. Army PSYOPs, we'll get to that. RHISAC, as well as all the data sources leveraged here. The goal for the presentation is to provide all of you, hopefully, with a lightweight four-pronged approach that provides a holistic view of how to approach an insider threat program. So if you're an infant or nascent program or don't even have one stood up, hopefully this provides a conceptual roadmap that you can follow. For folks that have established programs, this will also provide a few continuous improvement opportunities. So let's get into it. Why are we here? You always got to start with the stats. So 4 out of 5 security incidents since the beginning of the pandemic are directly related to insider threat. That's up significantly in the same time period. Even worse, most companies don't just have one of these each year. They have quite a few, and that's also up in the same time period. You may say, Paul, what the hell is this 82%? How's the breakdown between negligence or actually people that are trying to be intentionally malicious? So it's about 1/3, 2/3 split. We further break that down into what is actually happening there. Breakout of the data theft, intentional sabotage, fraud, or accidental disclosure. Then we look a little further and say, well, what are the primary industries or market segments that are getting impacted by this? Mostly technology, some critical infrastructure, as well as government. Then we have to look at how much is it costing them. So the average cost ranges between 8 and 15. That's up since the same time period. And then if we mass that over the number of employees, that range gets a little bit broader. And the interesting point here, you think about a company that has 75,000 employees. A lot of times those companies, not to say 22 million wouldn't be a significant speed bump that has like C-level attention, but more importantly for a company that's under 500 employees, a hit from $8 million from a single incident could potentially cause them to close their doors. So before I put this last statistic up on the board, right now the current state of affairs is a little bit over a quarter of all IT jobs are remote or work from home. The point here is I'm one of those, and I don't ever want to go back to the office. At least I'm absolutely all about being able to work in my pajamas or whatever type of attire that you want to do from home and being able to be around the family. That being said, as cool as remote jobs are, there's a lopsided statistic where most of the prosecutions are actually coming from people that are working from home. So before anybody takes a picture of that, and I don't want to be the proponent or the poster boy for like go back to office policy or campaigns, but from a sheer like data perspective, it's a hard statistic to ignore. So there may be some proof there.
All right, so a lot of stats thrown at you there. I failed my first stats class in college, but I still can recognize the importance of what those stats means. And kind of one of the important ones was that first one, which is 82% of security threats are coming from insider threats. So if you're CISOs out there or you're working within your security, you can't put your head in the sand and be an ostrich. You have to realize the trend is that these things are happening more and more.
So that brings us to the PsyOps shout out. If nobody's seen the really creepy recruiting picture or recruiting poster and the associated video they put together, it's literally talking about the folks that already have access, they're already in the system, etc. So we're hoping that by the end of this, we will be able to lay out a very clear approach to how to address insider threat. To the beginning of that, we have to start with actually the component data classification. So DLP. Definitely not a human aspect of this, right? But if everything's critical or everything's a priority, that really translates to nothing being a priority or nothing being critical. So the first step of the roadmap or the process to getting this under control is actually figuring out what are those critical assets and defining those and trying to be very, very frugal about what you apply there. Because if everything's viewed as a crown jewels, how does that work when it comes to investigation, Greg?
Sure, so one of the three kind of pillars we think about is knowing your people, knowing your threats, and knowing your data. So when we talk about data, everyone should know the concept of crown jewels. But for you guys, it's your IP, intellectual property, your source code, whatever you want to call it, your secret sauce. You guys need to be able to identify what that data is, clearly understand what the data is, and then make sure you have the appropriate safeguards. I want to make sure I don't fall off the stage. Appropriate safeguards in place to protect that data. Who has access to the data? Where is it going? Do you have physical safeguards on that data, safe, et cetera, digital safeguards on that? You have to be able to prove that if there's an economic espionage type activity, which I investigated, what we look at first is did that company have the active protective measures in place to ensure that not everyone had access to it, that it was actually some kind of IP that was a trademark for your company, and then what was the value of that? What can you define the value? Sometimes you talk about R&D, you got to be able to place a value on that because I have to go to a prosecutor and present the elements of the crime. And if a prosecutor can't demonstrate to a jury that you have these things in place, then guess what? You don't have a case. Okay? Oh, mine too, sorry. Scary clown, sorry. So yeah, scary clown, that could have been my scary clown at my daughter's birthday party, or it could be it, whoever it is. But the point is we're going to now start talking about the human factor of our pillars there. Know your data, know your people, know your threat. So we're going to be talking about and trending towards what we are going to be talking is a holistic approach to insider threat.
With that, let's talk about the confluence of risk, capability, and motive. So with privilege, this is zero trust architecture, definitely ZTA heavy in terms of just trying to remove pervasive access within your environment, as well as when people are looking for sensitive information or those crown jewels, do they actually have a legitimate need to know for business sense? Then we look at risk and vulnerability. We have to actually be aware of these as they relate to the user community as well as assets. Then we have motive, which we're going to get into more in the coming slides, so I'm not going to address that a whole lot. Ultimately, how these overlap, the stuff in the green, just like a normal stoplight. Not to say that they don't matter, but it's limited risk, limited exposure, so those are less concerning. Where privilege and the risk overlaps, those are the people that could potentially take action, so we're definitely worrying about those. We're trying to monitor those, and we're trying to put buffer systems in place or reduce the opportunities they could have to turn into the DIDs, which ultimately we're trying to reduce overall. On the risk and vulnerability piece, we have to look at ways to separate or break out so people don't have, kind of similar to the privileged access. You know, you're trying to separate, this is more on the network side. Then for motive, we literally have to identify this. So a lot of it comes in pre-employment vetting, but there's also the newer term of stay interviews as opposed to exit interviews. It's probably good to have recurring sensing sessions with your employees. as well as things like UEBA and social dark deep web monitoring, etc.
Okay, so continuing to talk about our people. As you're trying to figure out who your people are, you have to know more than just their name, their email address, what their badge is, etc. We have to identify and develop a risk profile for those individuals who have access to the information in your company. So we're going to talk about a couple of different buckets here, but obviously to start off with, the most important one to start is your VIPs, your CEOs, CISOs, etc. These are the folks that have command over the company. They generally have a lot of access to everything within the company or can ask for it. They may be the public profile figure of your company, so they may be out there in different social media applications, let's say LinkedIn, for example. What are they putting on there? What are they posting on there? Is there PII information? What is out there as a adversary, whether that's a nation state or a criminal actor, looking at what is publicly available out there to start trying to build a profile of how they might try and do some kind of social engineering attack or any other attack. So your VIPs are kind of the first kind of stage of people that you want to make sure you are aware of and what they have access to. Common attack vectors we see with these type of individuals would be your common phishing and vishing and smishing, whaling, spear phishing attacks, and they typically are involved in BEC type attacks or social engineering methods to try and get at that information. Best mitigation kind of options that we suggest is obviously PII removal that's not necessary out there to see for all of the public. Doing physical harm monitoring, definitely education for your CISOs and your VIPs, and then doing the basic stuff of good hygiene and password phrases, making sure they have complicated passwords, and of course MFA. Moving on to the next category, we're then going into who has access to your money, your accounts payable, who's sending off the checks, your third-party draft folks. These are the individuals who probably have a lot of engagement with external actors to sign off on a bank account or provide a bank account. So obviously these are individuals that are also going to be an attack vector for them, would be BEC type activity as well. So we also want to see whether or not they have compromised or weak credentials. And then again, mitigation for them would also be employee education, again, passphrase policy, the same thing with your VIPs, but also having good pre-transfer controls. So making sure that if they get somebody hitting them up using like a spoofed email and something, usually a fraudster is trying to get someone to quickly do something. You have a second person there that they can say, hey, is this accurate? Hey, boss, did you ask for this transfer? It might take a little bit of time, and I know speed of business is what we all need to be, or you guys, not me. But you want to have that second check in place to make sure you do not just send $500,000 somewhere you didn't want it to go.
That brings us to third-party interactors. These are folks like supplier management, vendor management, etc. Similar to money movers, they also deal with a lot of external domains. They regularly take phone calls, so they have a little bit more complex, I guess, attack vector or landscape. Social engineering is still top of the list. BEC is definitely part of it. New entrant to this is active recruitment, which typically shows up on Deep and Dark, as well as potentially corporate espionage, depending what sector you're in. This mitigation options, very similar to the rest. Security awareness, training, DMARC solutions in terms of email web filtering, definitely a good place to talk there. MFA is going to be across the board, so you're going to see that show up everywhere. As well as before you actually get in bed with a new company or vendor, do pre-engagement third-party due diligence. Next is sensitive IP handlers. These are the folks that are playing with the crown jewels. Ultimately, as a persona, if we can just say it as a generality, this isn't 100% off the board, but normally by the nature of their job, they're more paranoid. So therefore, this group is less approachable in general from external domains, but they also have the crown jewels. So when we go back to that, these are things where you need to have more intense technical monitoring like UEBA, et cetera, and you definitely need to have things that are linked to the IP that is most sensitive to your organization. Last group, system admins. We actually were just going to have system admins up here. We added developers, I guess, as we started to do more and more research. The big thing there is these are the folks that have the most pervasive access in your environment. no other way to say it. Like, these are the super malicious folks. They're the ones that can kill the whole system, burn it to the ground in a heartbeat before you even realize what happened. So, still the same attack vectors from external side, but the inside agent is the big differentiator here. Employee education does help, but I'd say the bigger thing for these folks is try not to let them talk to anybody outside the company. Try and keep them boxed in or internal only, as well as having the same additional logging or security mechanisms that you would have for the sensitive IP handlers. And that brings us.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
Why would you bundle the system admins with the developers because the profile is not the same?
So actually, you're right, the profile's not the same. What we're seeing, I guess, in active recruitment as well as sale, and then developers for supply chain attacks specifically is kind of the angle of like how the impact or the blast radius gets much bigger for them. So that's actually why we group those together, but very fair question.
All right, so let's talk about motive. We have our friend Mr. Heisenberg there from Breaking Bad. So traditionally, and there's a lot of models for motive in espionage, but we're just going to hit on this one for sake of time and just to give kind of an example. So when we talk about traditional reasons for someone to commit espionage or an insider threat, one model that's used is MICE. Stands for money, ideology, compromise, and ego. So I'm just going to go through a couple examples and go through this. But so basically, obviously, money, we all can understand that. An insider threat is doing that for some kind of financial gain, whether they have financial issues, et cetera. Ideology is an interesting one. It obviously relates to someone's morals, their loyalty. Do they believe in the company? Does whatever they believe internally go against what that company is? For ideology, we typically see and use the examples of Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning. For some of you who may not be aware of Ana Belén Montes, she was a DIA analyst who spied for the Cubans, just was released not too long ago, but she spied for a long time. And she had a brother who was in the FBI. But the reason why she did it wasn't for money, she wasn't paid. She didn't necessarily have disgruntlement against the DIA, but she did disagree with the policies at the time related to the Western Hemisphere and what was happening. So she self-recruited herself and worked for the Cubans for quite a long time until she was arrested. The next kind of factor there is compromise. And for compromise, that means more like if an individual was put in a situation where a nation state or criminal actor can utilize that kind of vice, vulnerability, to make them do something that they didn't want to do. And so we might usually see someone who might be gambling per se, have a lot of financial issues, maybe a lot of stressors, may engage in prostitution or whatever. But obviously, it's something very damaging and secretive to them. Someone finds out about that risky behavior, and they may now be put in a position where they feel like they have no other recourse but to go ahead and go along with whoever is trying to compromise them. Another example, not as bad, but it could be a former business colleague who left to a competitor. And now that individual reaches out to that worker within your organization and entices them with, hey, you should come work for us. We have better Cheerios or whatever in the food market. All you got to do is just bring all that information that you still have access to, or can you start sharing that with me, and eventually try and get that person to go and trend in that direction. And then the last one would be ego, kind of like a little bit of a narcissism. Can I get away with something? An example that I like to use for that is Robert Hansen. Again, I'm kind of bashing the FBI today. But Robert Hansen, he was a special agent, supervisory special agent with the FBI, who was arrested in about 2001 for selling information to the Russian intelligence service, very damaging information that led to the deaths of Russians who were providing information to us. And he used a variety of different methods to get that out. He had a little bit of a technical background and manipulated our systems to be able to get that information out. But he was arrested. And when they arrested him, one of the things he said is, well, I did it because the US government didn't take security seriously, and I was so much better than all of you guys at it. So I wanted to prove that there was weaknesses in our apparatus, so that's why. One of the reasons I did it to show you guys. So it's that narcissism. It wasn't you. It wasn't me. I'm not bad. It's you guys, right? That's the narcissist. And then, he did receive about $600,000, so there's some money motivational factors there. There was some potential seeing of a dancer, exotic dancer, so then that goes to some other factors there. The other thing I didn't want to mention, in addition to just mice, is just disgruntlement and revenge as a motivator. Research shows that 75% of insider threat cases involved a disgruntled employee who left with company data, destroyed company data, or accessed company networks after their departure. All these things could be exasperated by, let's say, the Great Resignation or all the layoffs that's going on in the tech sector. As a motivational factor is why someone might have a grievance.
Hey, Greg, that's great. Do people just start out bad, or is there some kind of process?
No, people do not start off bad. So I also do work as it relates to targeted mass violence and active violence, active shooters. But what we use in these days is utilizing what we call the critical pathway to an insider. And basically what that is that a person just doesn't decide to come to work one day and I'm just gonna, start downloading stuff on a USB, or I'm deciding to go to a competitor and take all that information. Employees start off as trusted individuals that we give that trust to come to our organization. So they just don't appear one day and decide, I'm going to do this. It's more built on what we call a potential grievance factor there, where someone maybe feels like they have been slighted. Now, maybe did they not get the promotion they wanted? Did they find out that they are getting suspended? Did they find out maybe they're getting fired? So someone develops this particular grievance towards the company, and then they start to develop what we call an ideation, is how do I solve this grievance, whether it's a violent kind of fantasy or it's a kind of idea as to how do I get access to information that will help me. And then you go along to the next stage, which would be exploration, as to, or even the tipping point there, but exploration more is like, how can I go about exfiltrating this data from the company? Okay, and the important kind of part for us as insider threat investigators is kind of the first two points that are more internally in your head. Once you start exploring and kind of research and planning, you're turning thought into action. So for us, those are the first signs we could see as investigators, where someone is maybe testing measures, which leads to experimentation. That's where you have an individual who starts looking to aggregate data. Maybe they're changing file names. Whatever it is that they're using to kind of mask what they're doing or test how much information I can get, or even if it's just printing a lot of documents. That's what we see in the experimentation phase. And then we move on, obviously, to the execution, to actually doing that, sending it to a drop file or emailing it to yourself. And then the escape would be, obviously it makes no sense. It's how you actually get away with the data. Do you blame somebody else? Do you do an unauthorized disclosure to the media? What is the way that you're actually doing that encounter?
So with all of that in frame, let's step a little bit past just the theory and actually look at what the DIDs actually look like. So the first group we'll call the oops. This is Pandora. She's opening up her inbox, about to click on that attachment or the link, etc. These aren't the folks that are doing it intentionally. And normally after they click whatever that bad link is and then their device starts working really wonky, they normally reach out to IT and say, hey, I messed up, I clicked this link, please save me, etc. So these aren't the ones that are trying to burn you down, but just as well they can let something really bad into your environment. That brings us to the ouches. So the picture of Morpheus up there at the top, that kind of relates back to what Greg was saying about Hansen in terms of somebody internal that's shouting from the rooftops all the things that they think are wrong about a given security control. And for whatever reason, leadership is not able to take action fast enough, or they don't prioritize it, etc. And that person ends up getting jaded enough that they actually rationalize the best way to do this is to do the bad action themselves, because at least then it's an internal person. But what they don't realize is it's still an insider act at that point. We also have whistleblowers and corporate espionage. Depending on what segment that you're in, that may be a more pervasive issue or one that doesn't even exist. And then we have the all hells. No real way to go around this. This goes back to the system admins. The people that have the technical knowledge to fulfill the attack themselves. These people don't need to go out to Google and look it up. They don't need to talk to somebody else where somebody else is going to report it to HR and say, hey, somebody was talking to me about doing something bad inside the company. These people can literally just wake up and it be the day they're going to do it. So with that, brings us to MITRE's Center for Threat Informed Defense and my man Sunil. They put together a research study that ended up with just over 40 cases of real-world impact, as well as sensitive data exfiltration, and it was mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. For those of you in the audience, if you haven't dealt with the MITRE ATT&CK framework, we'll do a brief overview here in a second. But the short version is it maps out the life cycle of an attack. And they were able to narrow it down to only 20 sub-techniques, so that going back to the infant programs, it allows you to focus and zero in on those TTPs that you really need to think about. So let's look at this. What are those 20? This is broken out by frequency distribution. Obviously, the red ones happen the most frequent. The yellow ones happen the least frequent. But instead of worrying about 556 or whatever we're up to in terms of techniques and sub-techniques, this is a short list that you could do as a phased rollout in terms of I'm going to try and address the red ones first, then phase 2 be the oranges, phase 3 be the yellows. But you may be more interested in how it maps across the MITRE ATT&CK framework itself. So here, it's kind of light on the left, more heavy on the right. As you might imagine, insiders are actually in your environment already, so it's something that there's less reconnaissance steps that need to be taken in that regard. But when we look at this, the way that it actually visualizes is it gives you points like bottlenecks to focus on. So instead of just trying to solve for everything and boil the ocean, focus on the hot spots and think in attack chains or attack flows. There's probably a lot of other ways that people say that, but eventually what you're doing is mapping the TTPs all the way through the attack. So if we were trying to solve for, let's say, data leakage or exfiltration, we would be looking at what's the most common means. Well, it turns out the data shows us that exfil to cloud storage and exfil via USB are the most common. Not to say that there aren't others, because I think that my partner in crime here will talk about a few here in just a second. But ultimately, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, don't boil the ocean. Focus on the couple specific TTPs and come up with a solution just for those. With that, Greg, can you tell them a little bit?
Yeah, great research study and great points here. The only thing else I would emphasize, and we touched on this already, is research still shows, and what we see investigative-wise, is the use of personal email, sending an email from your corporate email to your personal email, while not sophisticated at all, that is still a common method to exfiltrate data for the less sophisticated insiders. And again, and something else to note with the MITRE framework here is your insider doesn't have to do half of those first steps, right? Because they're already in your organization. And then depending on the level, if it's a super malicious insider, that you may see them being able to do more sophisticated ways to exfiltrate the data, or you may just have someone who knows how to just print screen or print a large amount of documents. Something to consider. So what we want to talk about next, again, know your people, know your data, know your threat, is talking about that data. And so how do we go about looking at the anomalous behaviors and detecting that within your systems? Paul?
So let's talk about anomaly detection and kind of do an industry view, or kind of like what's happened over the last maybe decade or so, a little bit longer. We all started with global. So when the meteor strikes, everybody on the earth knows it, dinosaurs, all that jazz. So what does this look like inside an enterprise system? At least first thing that comes to mind is like a ransomware event where you see like a mass encryption. Everybody knows when it happens and pretty much right when it happens. But how does that help us be more proactive? Would we be able to detect something in enough time to actually avert impact? So global anomaly detection doesn't really work, is what industry ended up finding out. That led us to time series. So the next step, we're gonna come into your environment, we're gonna baseline for a long time, and we're gonna see what looks like normal, and we're gonna try to identify the outlier conditions. What industry quickly learned about that is twofold. Turnover in IT environment is pretty quick, so it's something that a lot of times the accounts or the personas that you're baselining will end up leaving your environment before you're actually able to usefully apply the model. Then the other problem is if you already have bad in your environment and they're taking bad actions at the time that the baseline's occurring, you actually may be training the model to think that bad activity is good or normal. That led industry to look at contextual analysis. And what this is you're looking at a single application or a single service, single variable, however we want to state that, and you're trying to find the outlier conditions against that single variable. So what you'll do is you'll set up control limits or some type of thresholding, and you're trying to find the things that happen outside those limits. This is where we start to get into the cool stuff. The only hard part about contextual is it doesn't give you a macro view of what's happening across the whole enterprise. And that brings us to the sexiest version of anomaly detection, collective. So here in more recent times, we're not seeing the outlier conditions. What we're seeing is like security or defense evasion tactics So the best way to detect those are people that are running the ragged edge. They're not actually breaking through those threshold conditions. They're running right at the red line, if you will. You might imagine as these things were developed across the industry, we are gaining complexity as we go across the slide, as well as increasing cost. And then these things should be tied directly to your role-based access control groups. Ideally, one group, as in an HR employee, would have a different type of activities that you would see as opposed to somebody in a different department. With that.
All right. You can't have insider threat talk without the stereotypical iceberg, right? Which obviously demonstrates that, what are you looking at? You have your threats up top, but you don't know what's going down underneath, deep dark web, et cetera. Our verticals for threat sectors there are still telecom, financial, retail is our top, middle, and third. Obviously, telecom being all of you guys here today. But the importance of this is utilizing all the different tools and variables that you have. I talked a little bit about your VIPs and your et cetera, your threat. Data, people, and threat is kind of your pillars, right? So threat, what is it? What are we talking about when we're talking about threat? We can talk about insider threat, or we can talk about external threat. I want to focus a little bit about the external threat and kind of knowing your people, knowing what your people are doing outside your company, outside of your business, knowing who might want to take and steal that information. Is it a nation state? Is it a criminal group? Is it a competitor? You have to be able to think outside of the box and identify who are those bad actors who are trying to steal my information, but also who are my employees who are most vulnerable based on their risk behavior, based on what your HR departments have, based on anonymous reporting within your company, to identify who are my employees that are most risk internally and both externally, okay? And that's where data threat intelligence can help you in that aspect to try and identify what are people doing offline, what are they doing on the dark web. So Paul is going to give you a little bit of a taste here of an example.
So with that, this is an actual real deal posting from Lapsus. This actually points back to why we were talking about active recruiting a little bit earlier, and just how pervasive it is. These posts are out there. There are definitely a lot of different groups trying to actively recruit insiders that already have network access or access to sensitive data, IP, etc. So as we start getting all excited and saying, ooh, I want to pull out my Sherlock Holmes hat and my, the magnifying glass there, before you do that, realize that there are definitely sharks swimming in the pool too. And the other point of reference, if you can't do deep and dark web research safely, may consider doing a third party or an outside firm that is more capable in that space. The other part that I would say, just as a word of warning, if you haven't poked around this space, that part of the internet's a lot less regulated. So if we say it like this, before you go out looking for something, beware, because you might just find what you're looking for, or a really weird alternate version of it. With that.
So quickly, different strategies you could use to consider as you're hiring for your hiring folks, and your insider threat program should be talking to your HR and legal, is basic things. If you're bringing in an employee, onboarding new employees, you can do basic things. The FBI, we not only do a one-year background investigation, but everyone's polygraphed. I don't anticipate you guys are going to do that, but you can do your basic background investigations. You can do criminal history checks, looking for those kind of indicators that might indicate someone has a propensity to not follow the rules, et cetera. Talking with your legal department, whether or not you're allowed to do social media kind of scrubs. It's not just about these days, did that new intern you're hiring post something kind of racy on Instagram? But are they posting anything that would indicate any kind of racial bias to gender, et cetera, racial groups? Or are they engaged in, let's say, a Discord private group chat and doing things on there? Are they looking at domestic, violence, extremism? So there's just kind of some basic things you should be doing. And then once that employee is on board, you got to consider what kind of periodic background checks are you doing? In the government, we do continuous vetting. We moved from doing every 5 years, you get your background investigation, and then you get your polygraph. So make sure you're good, and haven't done any security incidents going up into that polygraph. but you should talk with your legal department and your HR to figure out what's the best method to try and identify employees that maybe are not following the rules, have security incidents, maybe have indications that they are disruptive in the workplace. All of those different factors that you should be looking at and working with your IT folks and your system admins, et cetera, to develop these risk profiles so that you can put people that are high-risk categories in a different bucket. So you don't have to waste all your time with maybe people who are failing, the phishing campaigns, et cetera. Those are, people that we need to address through education, but hopefully you have processes to automate those things so that you can deal with the real problem employees. And when I say problem employees, I'm not trying to discriminate them. These are people that might be in crisis. You should be working with your HR, your employee assistance programs, to identify people who might need some additional help. We want to get those people off a bad pathway, as I discussed, and bring them back into a good environment where we can get them the help they need.
So with that, what happens when you actually have an incident? How do you handle it? A little bit before that, hopefully you have a little bit of pre-planning, you got some policy in place. Definitely comes down to simple things like what Greg had spoke to earlier in terms of pre-hire vetting. But more importantly, this is like acceptable use policies. How should they be using your devices? How should they be accessing data? Hopefully that stuff's a little bit defined so that they can't say, well, I didn't know, you didn't tell me. Then you move to alerting. You have to be able to actually see or have visibility, something into your environment. Have some idea, a way to aggregate those, prioritize them, et cetera. Hopefully you have a group that can actually respond to those alerts. And that comes into the triaging piece. If anybody in the room's been an IR kid, I'm giving you a big hug right now, or vulnerability management for that matter, I'd give you a big hug as well, because we've all dealt with false positives. We've all tried to sift through the noise. It's a freaking nightmare. So with this, it gets even harder because you can't typically directly contact the insider. User or a regular security incident, you can reach out and say, hey, did you click on that link? Or did you open the attachment, et cetera. Whereas this, there has to be some level of investigation that's outside the employee, so it gets a little bit harder. Brings us to investigation.
Thank you, Paul. So when we go to investigation, again, that means both you guys internally. If you have that insider threat team, you're utilizing all the various different departments. That's legal, HR, your systems in place to identify anomalous behavior. Figure out what your insider threat team's policies are with your legal. How are you going to handle that? Are you going to interview somebody? Should you interview somebody? What are the ramifications around that? When do you bring in law enforcement? FBI. I recommend that you talk to FBI early on. Don't wait until an incident happens and then talk to us. Reach out to us. We have private sector engagement squads that go out and reach out proactively. Work us into your incident response plan.
So can I get a show of hands from the audience? Any Army kids or Marine kids in the room by any chance? Few hands, okay. So you guys have probably heard of left of boom. We're transitioning to left of click with that.
So the question to this slide, is there a patch for people? We say yes, there is. There's no magic bullet, but there is a way that we can address insider threat, and that's through a holistic approach of utilizing all the tools we talked about today, but also looking at the human factor, looking at engaging with your legal department, your HR, your other folks that have all these different pieces of information, but they have to get to a centralized kind of repository here, a person that is putting all those pieces together to ensure that you get a full picture, because it's all about context and behavior as you're utilizing all these kind of system tools and UABA stuff. You got to put it all together to make a picture of that.
Don't try and boil the ocean. Focus on the low-hanging fruit. So the example we talked about earlier was focused about data leakage specifically. So this is some examples for the USB and cloud storage, but it's definitely not meant to or intended to be all-encompassing from insider threat. We all know that network access is just another problem of this. It's not just data exfil. But the big thing is don't try and boil the ocean. Focus on the low-hanging fruit. And then lastly, if you are lucky enough to have internal funding and the capability and know-how to do deep dark web as well as OSINT intelligence analysis, it definitely behooves you, because a lot of times these are the spaces that you can find early warning of an impending situation before it actually gets realized. And a lot of times that's the only place that you can find it. This would be places where the active recruitment happens, or you have the employee actually posting saying that they would like to sell either access or data. So with that.
So just to wrap up, in summary, we think that the solution to the insider threat problem is the holistic approach to insiders. That is the key. Everyone has to be a stakeholder and work together on this threat. You got to break down the different silos of information, use the tools at your disposal, and work early with the FBI, for one. That way we can safeguard your troubled employees that might be in crisis, get them the help they need, educate your workforce on how to detect risk factors. We all need to work together to keep your employees safe, your businesses secure, and frankly, our citizens in our country safe from nation state and criminal groups who want to do us harm. So with that, we thank you, and we have two last slides here.
Contact information, how to get a hold of NESOS, as well as if you're interested in digging more into MITRE, their knowledge base and that research study that we cited for the data set. That's how to do that. I'll pause there for a second, at least I see cameras up.
We can put it back up.
Okay.
And then contact information for the FBI. Hopefully you guys are aware of our main reporting repository and mechanism for the private-public sector. If there's any kind of criminal activity or suspicious activity that you need to report to the FBI that deals with cybersecurity, the use of computer, internet crime center, ic3.gov is where you should make those reports. We have our local FBI San Francisco information up there, and other way to call in or go online as well is www.tips.fbi.gov. And you could always contact the FBI San Francisco local field office. We have some of our social media outreach up there, and my name again and email address. Feel free to reach out to me. I'll direct you to the right person. If you don't have that point of contact, then we are failing as the FBI to make the appropriate outreach.
It was a pleasure. Hope you enjoyed the show. Ready for any questions if anybody has any.